Jasmine Crockett went from a courtroom legend to a federal prisoner. She was betrayed, discredited, and locked away, not because she broke the law, but because she got too close to a brutal secret guarded by a powerful judge. But how did she turn the very system that tried to destroy her into the weapon that brought it all crashing down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind screamed through the canyons of Chicago's federal district like it knew something the public didn't. It wasn't just cold, it was biting, punishing, a kind of chill that cut through wool and bone and pride. Snowflakes swirled in frantic circles above the courthouse steps, dancing like ghosts over a city addicted to silence and spectacle. Then, without warning, a black SUV rolled up to the curb, its tires cracking ice beneath them like distant gunfire. The passenger door opened slowly, and out stepped Jasmine Crockett. Her wrists were bound tightly in federal-issue cuffs, silver and gleaming against the fabric of her tailored coat. She didn't stumble. She didn't shake. She stepped onto the frozen pavement with the unshakable poise of someone who had walked into far worse rooms and walked out with someone else's career in ashes. But this wasn't her courtroom. Not today. The press swarmed like jackals, dozens of them, cameras hoisted, mics shoved past federal agents. Jasmine, did you funnel money to Saudi shell companies? Are you the mole in the Energy Security Council? Were you working with foreign spies? Her name was no longer a symbol of justice. It had become a headline soaked in scandal. Reporters weren't asking questions. They were delivering sentences. Somewhere in the crowd, a protester held a sign that read, "From hero to criminal, Crockett must pay." The irony stung. Only a year ago, Jasmine had stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, grilling corporate executives for illegal drilling practices in West Africa. Her voice had once echoed through marble halls as a weapon of truth. Now she was being marched through that same marble, muzzled, labeled, and nearly erased. Inside the courthouse, the silence was louder than the storm outside. Her heels clicked against polished tile, flanked by two marshals who never loosened their grip. Jasmine didn't look around. She didn't need to. She could feel the eyes. Court clerks peered from their desks. Security guards leaned subtly to get a better view. Some faces showed shock, others curiosity, but most wore the smug comfort of watching someone fall. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another defendant. She was a threat. A powerful, unapologetically black woman who had won too many cases, dismantled too many networks, and asked too many questions no one else dared ask. And now somehow, she was the one in chains. They said she'd laundered millions through a Venezuelan hedge fund, that she hacked into Department of Energy databases using off-grid tech no one could trace, that she helped leak national security data to destabilize U.S. trade agreements. The indictment read like the plot of a John le Carré novel, but there it was, stamped and signed, now etched into her public image like a brand. No warning. No arrest warrant in advance. Just a sealed order, a black van at dawn, and a media blitz that had already declared her guilty. But as the agents led her through the final set of doors toward holding, something shifted in Jasmine's eyes. Not fear, not anger. Focus. The kind of focus only someone who had been hunted before could wear without shaking. Because Jasmine knew the system better than anyone in that building. She'd seen how corruption operated. Not in chaos, but in order. Not in darkness, but in suits and scripts and sound bites. But if Jasmine Crockett was the lightning rod, then the storm had a name. Judge Conrad Ashcroft. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of honor and law. Silver hair, measured words, a deep baritone that commanded silence the moment he entered a room. He'd served as judicial advisor to 3 U.S. presidents, held honorary doctorates from Yale and Oxford, and had been dubbed the last bastion of American constitutionalism by national media. Church-going, veteran-friendly, a man who quoted Lincoln and kissed babies during Bar Association galas. But behind the marble columns and perfect press photos lived something darker, a predator dressed in tradition. Ashcroft didn't climb to power. He was born into it. The Ashcroft name stretched back over a century, etched into courtrooms, libraries, and government halls like a brand burned into the foundation of American justice. And like many empires, his was built on exploitation, deception, and the ability to erase anyone who got too close to the truth. What no one dared say out loud was this: Ashcroft didn't just sit above the law, he sold it wholesale. Through a web of offshore shell companies, political influence networks, and a covert operation known internally as the Gray Investment Initiative, he funneled billions in dirty assets through government contracts, disaster relief budgets, and private recovery funds that never saw public audit. His partners? Oil barons, foreign financiers, even military-industrial backchannelers. It was all polished to perfection, buried behind legal subclauses, sealed court orders, and bought silence. But Ashcroft's empire wasn't unraveled by a headline or a whistleblower. It began to crack because Jasmine Crockett noticed a number that didn't add up. She was deep into the prep for a massive environmental lawsuit, representing a coalition of farmers and tribal landowners whose water had been poisoned by industrial runoff. It was supposed to be routine, a stacked case with overwhelming evidence and one of those mid-level corporate defendants trying to downplay liability. But Jasmine didn't do routine. She read every footnote, every financial disclosure, every subcontract buried in the back pages of the discovery binder. That's when she saw it, a payment labeled Resource Maintenance, Class C Gray Allocation, wired to a company that didn't exist on any public registry. No employees, no address, no tax ID, just a shell linked to a trust, protected by a judicial seal. When she cross-referenced the seal, her stomach turned. It had been signed off by Judge Conrad Ashcroft, not in passing, not by accident, deliberately, personally, repeatedly. To most lawyers, it would have been a curiosity, a red flag, maybe a delay. But to Jasmine, it was something more, a map with no names and a compass pointing straight into the heart of a hidden system. She pulled the thread, quietly, carefully. Over the next 2 weeks, she traced more than $40 million in gray allocations routed through environmental subcontractors connected to disaster cleanup programs that had never occurred. These weren't just errors. They were strategic diversions, money meant for victims and communities, funneled into private investments overseas. And at the center of every paper trail, behind every untraceable trust, was the same signature. Jasmine didn't know it yet, but she had just walked into the engine room of one of the most protected corruption schemes in the country. Ashcroft found out within 48 hours. He didn't flinch. He didn't send threats. He initiated protocol. Jasmine Crockett was not just a lawyer anymore. She had become a liability, a match hovering too close to decades of carefully buried gasoline. She had the mind of a prosecutor, the instincts of a whistleblower, and the voice of a woman the public actually listened to. She had followers, connections in the Senate, a proven record in high-profile litigation, and worse, she was clean, untouchable, or so she thought. Ashcroft understood something Jasmine hadn't yet learned. Truth isn't enough when you're fighting a machine built to erase it. His answer wasn't intimidation, it was strategy. He would not silence her. He would redefine her, turn her from a hero into a threat, make her so toxic no one would dare listen, no matter what she uncovered. He assembled a case with chilling efficiency. A team of federal prosecutors was randomly assigned to her. Sealed affidavits appeared overnight. Digital evidence surfaced, offshore accounts in her name, metadata suggesting classified document access, encrypted messages never sent, but convincingly real. The narrative was airtight. Jasmine Crockett had used her legal position to gain access to national infrastructure bids and sold key data to foreign energy contractors. It didn't matter that none of it made sense. It didn't have to. Ashcroft's brilliance was in the illusion of legitimacy. His fingerprints were nowhere near the indictment, but his shadow loomed over every word of it. She uncovered the truth, and for that, she wasn't confronted. She was erased, not with violence, but with paperwork, not with bullets, but with credibility. And the man behind it all didn't shout. He simply pressed send. And just like that, the machine moved from silence to spectacle. The first day of the trial began under heavy skies and tighter security than some terrorism hearings. Jasmine Crockett, in a charcoal gray suit that still clung to dignity, was led into the courtroom like a war criminal. No cuffs this time, but the message was clear. You are not welcome here. The prosecution wasted no time. They unveiled a sleek slideshow of evidence, timestamps, offshore transfers, audio files, and strings of encrypted emails supposedly traced to Jasmine's private account. Her photo appeared next to lines of code and heat maps of digital footprints, the kind of visual storytelling that makes a jury nod before they even understand what they're seeing. Jasmine's heart beat steadily, but her mind spun. None of it was familiar. Not a single email. Not one transaction. Fabrications so flawless, even her own legal team flinched. She leaned forward and whispered, "That's not mine." But the prosecutor was already narrating a digital heist with cinematic flair, like she'd written the script herself. Outside the courtroom, the media storm had turned into a full-on feeding frenzy. Evening news anchors opened with her face. Podcasts titled The Crockett Collapse trended in multiple states. One segment broke down the case like a crime docuseries, complete with moody music and faux computer screens blinking red. Hashtags flooded every platform. Fraud Queen, Crockett cracked, justice for the system. Talk show hosts who once praised her for fighting billion-dollar corruption now chuckled as they read excerpts from the indictment, mocking her fall from grace. A clip of her walking into court, eyes cold and silent, was looped on 24-hour news. One network ran it with the caption, "How the Mighty Lie." Jasmine's reputation, once pristine and powerful, was now digital shrapnel. Blasted into 1,000 misleading pieces, retweeted into character assassination. Even in court, the environment was poisoned. Jurors kept glancing at her like she was already guilty. The judge, hand-picked, connected to Ashcroft's old law clerks, allowed almost every piece of evidence in without objection. Jasmine's legal counsel, a veteran litigator named Saul Bernstein, tried to push back. He argued that the emails couldn't be authenticated, that the metadata looked tampered, that Jasmine's devices showed no trace of these files, but every motion was struck down before the argument even finished. The prosecution was too prepared, too polished, and too connected. Jasmine realized something in that moment. She wasn't on trial to be proven guilty. She was on trial to be destroyed. This wasn't a case. It was an execution with Wi-Fi. But the courtroom humiliation was just the beginning. The real war was quieter, calculated. It reached into Jasmine's life like a surgeon with a scalpel, severing every bond that once made her strong. It started with her brother, Marcus, a tech founder in Atlanta, clean record, nothing remotely criminal. He texted Jasmine late one night, "2 men just searched my place. No warrant. They said it was about you." The message disappeared an hour later. He never answered her calls again. Next came her cousin Talia, a high school science teacher. She was pulled out of class mid-lecture and questioned for 6 hours in a windowless room. No lawyer, no charges, just questions. Did Jasmine ever mention offshore money? Did she ever express anti-government views? Talia came home shaken. She told her husband they were being watched. The next morning, she deactivated every social media account she had. Then it hit her professional circle. Maya Benson, Jasmine's legal assistant, brilliant, tough, loyal, stopped showing up to the office. Jasmine assumed she was sick, maybe overwhelmed. Instead, she received an email. "I've been advised to step away from all professional contact. I'm so sorry." No explanation, no details. Maya vanished. Jasmine's paralegal got a letter from the state bar questioning his credentials. Her former clerk had his apartment searched. Subtle pressure, not outright threats. But everyone understood. This wasn't about guilt. It was about proximity. Ashcroft's message was clear. Help Jasmine, and you burn too. She was losing people by the hour. Allies, friends, even neutral colleagues avoided eye contact in courthouse hallways. Journalists she'd once mentored declined interviews. Her alma mater took down a banner with her photo. It was like watching her life implode in reverse. Familiar faces turned to ghosts, and silence replaced support. She was still breathing, still standing, but the world was already treating her like she was gone. Then came the hearing that sealed her fate. Bail denied. Her attorney argued the obvious. Jasmine had no prior convictions, no flight risk, no history of violence. She dedicated her career to legal reform and accountability. But the prosecution didn't argue facts. They argued fear. Jasmine, they said, had advanced digital capabilities, classified contacts, potential ties to foreign intelligence. They painted her like a walking cyber weapon, and the judge, appointed by Ashcroft's political bloc, nodded without hesitation. The risk to national security, he said, outweighs any personal considerations. Bail is denied. The words hit harder than the indictment. Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just looked up and said, "This isn't justice. This is design." But it didn't matter. In less than 10 minutes, she was escorted out of the courtroom and down a cold concrete corridor, the cameras still rolling, the headlines already writing themselves. They put her in protective segregation, but Jasmine knew what it really was. Isolation. 23 hours a day, locked in a box. No visitors, no phone calls, no natural light. Her cell was 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, steel toilet in one corner, metal slab with a paper-thin mattress in the other. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, always on, never off. The air stank of disinfectant and old metal. Her meals came through a steel slot. No forks, no glass, nothing that could be used for harm. Even her reflection was taken away. The tiny mirror had been removed. At first, she tried to keep her mind busy. She recited legal texts aloud, listed every constitutional clause she knew by heart, replayed every cross-examination she'd ever won. But days bled together. Time became slippery. Minutes felt like hours, and hours felt like smoke. She would speak just to hear a voice, even if it was her own. She whispered her own name at night just to remind herself she existed. Once on the 6th day, she banged on the door. A guard opened the hatch. She asked for a book. He said no. She asked why. He shrugged. "Orders," then shut the hatch. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Jasmine sat back down. Her wrists trembled, not from fear, but from rage she could no longer direct. Her voice, once her most powerful weapon, had nowhere to go. She wanted to scream the truth, claw it into the walls, shout that she had done nothing wrong. But she didn't. She swallowed it, sat in the silence, and survived one more hour, then another. One night she stared at the ceiling and whispered, "They can take my name. They can take my voice, but they don't get my mind. Not yet." She closed her eyes and counted backward from 100. It was all she could do to stay human in a place built to erase her. They cut her off from the world, not with violence, but with silence. Not with blood, but with boredom, with emptiness, with engineered despair. But Jasmine Crockett was still breathing, still thinking. And even in that cold, hollow cell, she was waiting for a crack in the walls. But just when it seemed like the walls would never break, when isolation had settled into her bones like cold steel, a door opened that shouldn't have. The guard hadn't said much, just tapped the cell bars and muttered, "You've got a classified visit, clearance level red." Jasmine didn't move at first. Her mind, dulled by days of artificial light and forced silence, struggled to register the words. Then she stood, slowly, cautiously, and followed. Her body felt stiff, but her instincts were alive again. They led her down 2 locked corridors and through 3 levels of reinforced checkpoints. This wasn't a standard legal visit. This was something off the books. Inside the interview room sat a man she didn't recognize at first. Early 60s, weathered face, black suit, no tie, steel gray hair cropped short, hands clasped on the table like a man who'd spent a lifetime giving orders no one questioned. But there was no badge, no files. Just those eyes, the kind that had seen too much and still didn't flinch. "Jasmine," he said, rising slightly. "Frank Dalton, former NSA. We've met before, though not face to face." She didn't answer, didn't sit, just stared, like a soldier scanning for traps. Frank gave a small nod, respectful. 7 years ago, Ravenlock Energy lawsuit. You were tearing their financial records apart in court. I was the one slipping documents to your co-counsel through an encrypted relay. You won that case, made a lot of enemies, including mine. Jasmine's voice cracked for the first time in days, quiet but razor sharp. And now you're here to, what? Offer me a lifeline? Or finish the job? Frank exhaled, slow and measured. Neither, I'm here to warn you. And then, maybe, ask for your help. That got her attention. Slowly, she lowered herself into the chair. Her eyes never left his. I've been tracking a deep net intel breach tied to Helixstrat, he said. They're a military-grade tech contractor operating under DOE subcontracts. What they're doing is dirty, weaponizing data pipelines disguised as environmental monitoring tech, scraping industrial infrastructure, rerouting it through foreign proxies. Russia, Southeast Asia, even domestic surveillance on energy infrastructure. He paused. Let it land. Jasmine, you didn't know it, but when you flagged that gray fund transfer in your environmental case, you unlocked a buried channel. The signature on the order? Ashcroft's. And that wasn't a coincidence. You didn't just threaten his reputation, you threatened the entire mechanism. She leaned back, arms folded, but her mind raced. So I stepped into the wrong room, and now I'm being erased for it. You didn't just step in, Frank said. You kicked open the wrong door. You're not just a nuisance. They see you as a threat to national continuity. You're being treated like an insider threat, Jasmine. They want you off the board. Quietly. Permanently. Jasmine's pulse thudded against her collarbone. She stayed calm, but her thoughts were speeding. She'd suspected a setup, suspected Ashcroft was dirty. But this? Espionage. Defense contractors. Data laundering. National agencies complicit. Why me? She asked. They've buried bigger threats, smarter ones. What makes me different? Frank leaned forward, tone cool and precise. Because you're public. You're clean. You're visible. And your mind scares the hell out of them. They can't bribe you, so they had to break you. But here's the thing. They rushed. They overreached. They left fingerprints they thought no one would find. He slid a thumb drive across the table. These are some of them. Jasmine didn't touch it yet. And what's your role in all this? She asked. Retired NSA doesn't show up in isolation blocks without clearance from someone above the clouds. I've been off-grid for 3 years, Frank said, following threads no one else would touch. I've got no badge, no budget, no backup. Just files, instincts, and a burning need to burn the whole thing down. A long silence stretched between them. The weight of everything sat on Jasmine's shoulders like a second sentence. You want me to flip the board, she said quietly. I want you to play dead long enough for them to stop watching your hands. Let them think they've won. Let the narrative take root. Meanwhile, I'll be digging. You'll be the smoke. I'll be the fire. Jasmine stared at the table, then at the cameras above, then back to Frank. And when they stop watching me? That's when you hit back, Frank said. That's when we drag them into the light. Jasmine's jaw clenched, but her eyes sharpened. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't drowning. She was calculating. It began with a press leak. Jasmine Crockett open to plea negotiations. Within hours, news outlets erupted. Cable hosts speculated about her mental state. Pundits dissected her every past case. Her former colleagues were quoted anonymously, calling her brilliant but obsessive, always a little too righteous. Hashtags flipped from rage to ridicule. Fraud Queen became Fall of Crockett, and networks aired split screens comparing her past victories to her present disgrace. Behind bars, Jasmine said nothing. She kept her answers short, her posture small, her tone subdued. It was a performance, but it wasn't easy. Each moment of silence scraped against her pride like sandpaper. But she held it because Frank was working. And for this to work, Ashcroft had to believe she was done fighting. Frank's team, half ghosts, half geniuses, were in overdrive. Cole, the encryption specialist, set up a mobile rig in a decommissioned fallout shelter outside Denver. He'd cracked firewalls used by rogue states. Now he was targeting sealed evidence stored under Homeland Security's Project Haven, the same archive where Ashcroft's digital dealings had been dumped and buried. Frank coordinated from a safe house in Virginia, using old spy tradecraft. No calls, no emails, just hand-carried drives and relay codes through darknet channels. Every day the team unearthed more. Access logs signed by Ashcroft's credentials, bank transfers routed through defense contract grants, hidden metadata showing deliberate fabrication of Jasmine's digital evidence. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was systemic, treasonous exploitation cloaked in national security. The final thread came from a man no one expected to speak again. Noah Quinn had been Ashcroft's right hand. He drafted rulings, handled off-the-record calls with lobbyists, even orchestrated judicial placements. After a quiet ethics investigation, he vanished. No public statement, no charges. Just silence. But Jasmine's trial shook something loose. Frank found him living under a false name in Montana, off-grid, teaching local law at a community center. When Quinn saw Jasmine's indictment, he cracked. He sent one sentence through a burner email. "I saw it all, and I can't die with it." What he delivered changed everything. Quinn's files contained internal memos detailing Ashcroft's manipulation of multiple high-profile trials, how he'd secretly guided federal prosecutors, handpicked judges, and ordered data fabrications against targets labeled national disruptors. Jasmine's name was on that list. Along with it, a time-stamped conversation in which Ashcroft allegedly said, "She's not a threat in court. She's a threat in headlines. Take her voice, and the truth dies quietly." Frank called Jasmine that night. No words, just static, then a click. It was the signal. "We have it." She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She waited. When the court reconvened the following week for final arguments, Jasmine entered in silence, alone. Her lawyers expected to handle the statement. Instead, she rose from her seat, calm but firm, and addressed the court herself. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear as crystal, "I waive counsel. I'll be speaking on my own behalf." Gas filled the room. The prosecution smirked. The judge narrowed his eyes. Jasmine stepped into the center. For the first time in weeks, her full power returned to her posture, her gaze, her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't shake. She commanded. "I know what you've been told about me, that I'm corrupt, that I betrayed my oath, that I sold out my country. You've been shown evidence. You've heard experts, but you haven't heard me. So let me make this perfectly clear. I'm not here to ask for mercy. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to speak the truth, even if it makes every man behind that bench feel ashamed." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were locked on the bench. "Your Honor," she said, "under Rule 15 CE of Federal Criminal Procedure, I am submitting late-stage evidence, verified, authenticated, and obtained via legal override granted this morning by the U.S. Office of Inspector General." The judge stared, unsure. Prosecutors stood, hands half raised in protest, but the clerk had already received the encrypted drive. Jasmine stepped back. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. A projection screen dropped from the ceiling, standard in high-security federal trials rarely used. And then, line by line, the documents began to appear. Bank ledgers first. To the untrained eye, they were clean. Transaction IDs, currency conversions, offshore routing. But to the sharp-eyed observers, especially in the press section, one thing was clear. These were not just passive holdings. They were active laundering paths. Dozens of wire transfers under the alias C.A. Reynolds funneled through international shell firms and into black budget accounts hidden inside climate research grants. The recipient firm was a data erasure contractor in Prague, one with known ties to privatized intel services. The amounts, millions. Each one signed digitally with an encryption key, the same key tied, without question, to Judge Conrad Ashcroft. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The press gallery erupted in whispered panic. Reporters scrambled for phones, some whispering into their recorders mid-scroll. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. The screen did the speaking for her. Then came the final blow. A grainy video, time-stamped, authenticated, no edits. 4 men in a secure conference room, anonymous, mostly obscured. But the man at the head of the table was unmistakable. Ashcroft. No robe, no bench, just a man in a tailored navy suit, leaning back in a leather chair, sipping bourbon. She's loud, he said, and she's careful, which makes her dangerous, but not invincible. The strategy's the same. Isolate, discredit, bury. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but the words rang like gunfire. Start with digital leaks, financial misconduct, foreign contacts. Flood the system with just enough data to make her radioactive. Then let the media do the rest. One of the shadowed figures asked, "In the trial?" Ashcroft smiled, calm, certain. She won't win. She won't even finish. She'll fold under pressure or rot in isolation. Either way, she becomes the lesson. The room went silent. In the courtroom, reality shattered. A juror gasped audibly. Another dropped their notepad. The prosecution froze, ashen. The gallery turned from stunned silence to riotous chaos, dozens standing, voices raised, phones held high, streaming live. One woman yelled, "Oh my God, he did it! He really did it!" Another cried. The judge hammered the gavel again and again, but no one was listening anymore. Across the courtroom, Ashcroft stood slowly. His face was hard, locked in disbelief. His voice cracked, not from age, but from exposure. "That footage is doctored. I want that drive confiscated. This is a conspiracy to frame me." No one moved, except the two federal marshals seated in the back row. They rose, moved in tandem, quiet, deliberate, rehearsed, as if they'd known this moment would come. One of them approached Ashcroft, reaching into his coat, retrieving the warrant. The other circled behind. The silence was now razor sharp. "Conrad Ashcroft," the lead marshal said, "you are under arrest on suspicion of judicial conspiracy, obstruction of justice, digital evidence tampering, and abuse of federal authority." Ashcroft took a single step back. He looked to the bench. The judge didn't lift a finger. The cuffs clicked shut. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just watched, as the man who'd orchestrated her downfall was finally dragged into the light he'd spent a lifetime hiding from. He built his empire in shadows, ruling through fear, silence, and power passed down like bloodline. But Jasmine Crockett brought the sun, and when truth finally shone on him, he didn't burn. He shattered. For 143 days, Jasmine Crockett had been labeled a traitor, a fraud, and a ghost. And then, in one sharp breath of truth, the weight of it shattered. It didn't come with applause. It came with silence. A silence so heavy it echoed through marble courtrooms, newsrooms, and the darkest corners of federal offices that once whispered her name like a curse. Jasmine stood still as the judge officially vacated the charges. No conditions, no apologies, just cold legal clarity. The United States hereby drops all proceedings against Dr. Jasmine Crockett due to evidence of malicious prosecution and judicial misconduct. The gavel fell. Her life began again. But what do you do when you've survived a war no one saw? One fought not with bullets, but with signatures, silence, and the system itself. You rebuild, but not for yourself, for the others still trapped inside the machine. Jasmine exited through a side door. No cameras, no press, just the wind and a scarred freedom. Saul was waiting. He offered a quiet nod, the kind only someone who's walked through fire with you can give. "You're free," he said. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were on the horizon. "No," she said, "I'm just out." The media circus exploded the next morning. Every network flipped its narrative. Jasmine's face appeared everywhere. TV, podcasts, online headlines, subway ads. Clips of her courtroom statement were played over slow music, dissected like scripture. Activists called her the new face of judicial reform. Senators released statements, careful and delayed. Even the president issued a tweet calling her a symbol of resilience and integrity. But Jasmine ignored them all, because the day after her release, she walked into an empty downtown building, 4 floors of cracked tile and broken glass, and placed a single sheet of paper on the front desk. The Crockett Initiative Legal Defense, Public Protection, Government Accountability, because no one should fight the system alone. That was it. No speeches, no ribbon cutting, just one woman, still battle-bruised, ready to build something stronger than vengeance. At first, it was just her, a laptop, a burner phone, a cot in the back room. She worked 20-hour days reviewing case files, fielding letters from inmates and whistleblowers, scanning sealed court orders for familiar patterns. Signatures, language, timestamps. The same tools that once buried her were now her weapons. Within weeks, 2 former public defenders joined. A law student she mentored at Howard quit her job at a top DC firm to help run intake. A journalist who'd smeared Jasmine during her trial sent a letter, a full retraction, and a donation. But it wasn't just lawyers. It was a trauma counselor from a women's detention center, a cybersecurity analyst who used to work for Homeland, a mother whose son had been convicted by Ashcroft's court. They didn't come for pay. They came because they had nowhere else to put their outrage. And Jasmine gave it a name, a purpose, a fight, and fight they did. Within 3 months, the Crockett Initiative filed formal motions to reopen 4 of Ashcroft's old cases. They exposed inconsistencies in evidence handling, discovered sealed communications between prosecutors and third-party donors, and submitted over 900 pages of documentation gathered from Frank Dalton's whistleblower network. One of those motions resulted in a full reversal. A man sentenced to 22 years for a white-collar charge walked free. Jasmine met him at the gates herself. No press, no fanfare, just a quiet handshake and 4 words. "You're not alone anymore." But it wasn't enough. She knew the system was still intact, still grinding. Ashcroft was just one head of a larger beast. There were others, judges, politicians, corporate donors hiding behind PACs and shell foundations. The initiative had tapped into something electric, a current of public rage, long ignored, now awake. Survivors of legal abuse came forward. So did their families. So did insiders. The inbox flooded, and Jasmine, ever methodical, answered each one. Not because she had to, but because she remembered what it felt like to scream into silence and hear nothing back. Some nights she couldn't sleep, not because of fear, but because she could still hear the sound of the cell door locking, the way the guards wouldn't look her in the eye, the way her reflection disappeared when they took away her mirror. Trauma didn't go away. It carved itself into the rhythm of your thoughts. But Jasmine didn't run from it. She used it, weaponized it, turned it into armor. Law schools began teaching her case. Civil liberties groups cited her as a precedent. The DOJ created an internal panel to investigate prosecutorial manipulation, the Crockett Standard, they called it. And across the country, people started asking questions again. Not just, is the system broken, but who broke it, and how many more are still trapped inside? Jasmine didn't chase recognition. She didn't write a book or sell a documentary. She showed up every morning before anyone else. She read every name. She wrote letters by hand to inmates serving time under Ashcroft's rulings. And when she sat across from them, across glass, across trauma, across years, she never asked if they were innocent. She asked, "How did they bury you?" Because that was what she understood better than anyone, the process of quiet erasure. And she wasn't letting it happen again. By the 1-year anniversary of her exoneration, the Crockett Initiative had helped reopen 12 cases, dismantled 1 state-level corruption ring, and exposed a federal evidence suppression scheme tied to defense contractors. Jasmine never held press conferences, but the walls of the office, once bare, now carried dozens of letters taped with tacks, from survivors, from mothers, from lawyers who'd finally found the courage to blow the whistle. Each letter began the same way. "Thank you for not giving up." She'd stand there sometimes alone reading them, letting the silence be a different kind of quiet now. One filled with voices returning, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't interested in legacy. She was interested in repair, in making sure that the next Black woman who spoke too loud in the courtroom didn't get shackled in metadata and media spin, that the next young whistleblower didn't have to choose between prison or silence. That power, no matter how hidden, could still bleed when cut right. They took her freedom and tried to write the ending, but Jasmine Crockett picked up the pen, and now every time she walks into a courtroom, it's not for herself, it's for the fight, for the ones who didn't survive, for the truth buried in sealed files and forgotten cells. And she's not done, not even close. For a man who had just been arrested in front of a federal courtroom, Conrad Ashcroft didn't look defeated. He didn't flinch when the cuffs clicked, didn't blink when the marshal read him his rights. He didn't shout, didn't protest. He simply turned his head, looked straight at Jasmine Crockett as they passed her row, and smiled. Not the smile of a man ruined, the smile of a man who'd already laid his next trap. That smile haunted her for days. In the media, Ashcroft's fall was painted as total. Headlines labeled him the fallen judge, the black robe of corruption, the man who nearly killed justice. Clips of his arrest went viral. Commentators called him a symbol of the old guard's rot. Protesters gathered outside the federal holding facility where he was detained, demanding deeper investigations. Members of Congress scrambled to erase their affiliations with his judicial appointments. Think tanks deleted entire web pages. Ashcroft's name became radioactive. But Jasmine had learned something in her time in solitary. The system doesn't collapse just because a name is erased. And Ashcroft's name, despite the cuffs, wasn't quite gone. Inside that holding facility, Unit 8C, reserved for federal offenders with national security ties, Ashcroft had access. Not to technology, not to phones or networks, but to memory. And connections that were loyal not to the law, but to the game. Former clerks, judges who owed him favors, prosecutors he'd once protected, lobbyists who once funded his personal PAC. Within a week of his arrest, an anonymous 87-page legal assessment appeared online. It questioned the validity of the metadata evidence used in Jasmine's defense. The language was surgical, clearly written by a team with deep experience. Footnotes referenced obscure evidentiary cases from the 90s. The report didn't say Ashcroft was innocent. It simply raised doubt. That was enough for his followers. Small news outlets picked it up, then talk radio, then podcasts. Conservative influencers started calling Jasmine the deep state's chosen face and labeled her trial a media op designed to bury Ashcroft before he could expose corruption within intelligence agencies. The same man who once ruled through fear now began reinventing himself as a martyr, and it was working. A fringe PAC launched a site called Ashcroft Uncensored. It featured old clips of him giving graduation speeches, writing op-eds on national stability, shaking hands with former presidents. They painted him as a tragic patriot, destroyed not by justice, but by a system afraid of what he knew. Jasmine's team discovered the PAC had been dormant for 5 years, until 3 days after Ashcroft's arrest. The new donor list was redacted. Frank Dalton, watching from his encrypted safe house, sent Jasmine a message. "He's not done. Watch the shadows." She didn't need the warning. 3 nights later, her office was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but someone had moved things. A drawer she always kept locked was slightly ajar. A paper clip she kept on her desk, bent into the shape of a J, was missing. It wasn't a robbery, it was a message. The next day, she discovered her inbox had been targeted by a spear phishing attempt. The sender, an email disguised to look like a DOJ contact. It carried a Trojan payload designed to pull browser history, notes, and client files. Luckily, Cole, her encryption specialist, caught it, but the breach had been professional. Government-level code. Jasmine knew what it meant. Ashcroft couldn't touch her in court anymore, but he could taint the air around her. Then came the real hit. On a rainy morning in October, the Crockett Initiative's third major case, a class action suit involving wrongful evictions from a prison-owned construction company, was dismissed on technical ground. Judge cited suspicious similarities between Jasmine's opening brief and language from an unrelated memo leaked online. The accusation? Plagiarism, fabricated evidence, a smear. Jasmine demanded to know who leaked the memo. 2 hours later, she got a copy of the leak. It had come from a clerk's desk inside the Office of Special Counsel, a clerk who once interned for Ashcroft. The system hadn't collapsed. It had tightened around itself. Saul urged her to take a step back. "This man doesn't care about winning anymore," he warned. "He wants chaos. If he can't win the game, he'll light the board on fire." But Jasmine wasn't built to retreat. Instead, she doubled down. She launched a full audit of every financial connection tied to Ashcroft's judicial history. She reopened data files linked to court contracts, private donors, and evidence management firms he'd used during his career. The deeper her team went, the more they uncovered. Campaign bundles disguised as legal research funding, offshore payments funneled into judicial scholarship foundations, bonuses paid to prosecutors after high-profile convictions, all approved under Ashcroft's oversight. But more than the money, it was the network that chilled her. He wasn't a solo architect. He was the keystone of a structure designed to manipulate legal precedent from within. Each ruling he wrote had ripple effects: reversals denied, appeals delayed, certain forensic labs contracted over others. Dozens of convictions had been quietly streamlined into prisons now owned by privatized contractors, the same companies donating to Ashcroft's shadow PACs. This wasn't about one bad judge, it was infrastructure. And Jasmine realized taking Ashcroft down wasn't the end of the war. It was the first artillery shell. Behind bars, Ashcroft waited. He refused interviews, spoke only through court motions filed by an increasingly aggressive legal team. He requested bail twice. Both were denied. He requested trial dismissal. Denied. But he wasn't angry. He was patient. And Jasmine began to see why. A leaked memo surfaced. Ashcroft had prepared a series of sealed testimonies, not just about his own rulings, but about deals, names, places, meetings. He'd written them as insurance policies. If he fell, he would take others with him. His final card wasn't exoneration, it was leverage. What Jasmine understood in that moment wasn't that Ashcroft wanted to survive. It was that he wanted to shape the collapse. He wanted to control the narrative of how he fell, turn himself into a martyr, spark enough doubt, seed enough chaos, that the next person who tried to expose a corrupt judge would think twice. And in that way, he could still win. So Jasmine made a decision. She called a press conference, not to talk about Ashcroft, but about the system that protected him. She released 14 pages of evidence, not from his case, but from his colleagues. A silent reckoning, done not with fury, but with documents, timestamps, case law. "I'm not here to talk about a man," she said into the camera. "I'm here to talk about a blueprint, because if we think this ends with handcuffs, we're still living in his world." The cameras froze. Reporters went quiet. And far away in a prison cell lined with steel and fluorescent light, Ashcroft watched it all on a state-issued monitor and smiled again. It was the kind of rain that didn't just fall, it clung, cold, constant, whispering against the windows of the Crockett initiative like a warning. Jasmine had been up since before dawn. She was alone in the office, which wasn't unusual. Most of her staff had gone home hours earlier, their desks cluttered with case files and half-eaten takeout. She sat at the far end of the second floor, surrounded by walls covered in pinned articles, maps, and case notes. A coffee sat untouched beside her keyboard. Her eyes were fixed on a sealed deposition from a 2009 wrongful conviction. She barely heard the first knock. Software. 3 quick taps. Then silence. She checked the time. 11:42 p.m. Another knock. Firmer now. Jasmine stood slowly, cautious, and walked through the empty hallway. The lights flickered once. Cheap wiring. She reached the front door, checked the side window, and froze. A boy, not a man. Not a teenager trying to look older. A boy, soaked to the bone, standing perfectly still. Hood pulled low, a plastic grocery bag gripped tightly in both hands like it held something alive. Jasmine opened the door part-way, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Office is closed." The boy didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, steady. "My name's Devin. You don't know me, but I need your help." Jasmine studied him for a long second. Rain streaked down his cheeks, not tears, just water. But his eyes carried something older than his face. She opened the door fully. "Come inside." He sat on the edge of the reception couch, still clutching the bag. Jasmine gave him a towel. He didn't use it, just placed it on his lap and stared at the wall. She brought him hot tea. He didn't drink it. Finally, she sat across from him and said nothing. That broke him. "My brother's name is Malik," he began. "He's been in prison for almost a year now. No trial, no press, no lawyer who'll stay more than a week. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. Charges? Computer crimes. They said he hacked into a defense contractor, that he accessed data tied to the Department of Energy. Jasmine's heart paused mid-beat, but her face remained still. They told my mom not to talk to anyone, that it was a national security breach, but they never showed us anything. No files, no evidence. Just silence. Devin slowly reached into the plastic bag, pulled out an envelope, yellowed, water damaged, taped shut along every edge. He placed it on the table between them. He gave me this the night before they came for him, told me not to open it, told me to find someone who wasn't afraid of judges. He looked up at her now, eyes locked. I think he meant you. Jasmine leaned forward and carefully peeled the tape. Inside, 2 USB drives, handwritten notes, and a folded printout of code snippets. Raw, unformatted, but unmistakably from a surveillance interface. She recognized the formatting style instantly. Her stomach turned. The label on the drives, ECHO.log. 10 minutes later, Cole was in the office. He ran the drives through an isolated sandbox rig, typing so fast Jasmine couldn't follow. On the main screen, a string of system tags populated in real time. Code fragments appeared, not scripts, but metadata protocols, and buried inside an access credential tied to Helix Strat, the same defense contractor named in Jasmine's original trial. But this wasn't GrayNet. This was newer, cleaner, meaner. Cole sat back, rubbing his forehead. This is Project Echo. I've only seen whispers. Everyone thought it was internal predictive analysis, standard defense optimization. It's not, Jasmine said. What is it really? Cole clicked into one of the decrypted files. A location grid appeared. Dozens of red pins across the country. Schools, homes, law firms, community centers. It's a predictive suppression algorithm, Cole said grimly. Not just monitoring people, flagging them, scoring them, based on what they might do. Protest, leak data, file lawsuits, speak out. He clicked again. A profile appeared. Crockett, Jasmine. Threat score, 9.82 out of 10. Recommend contain. Jasmine stared. Cold fire filled her lungs. Project Echo didn't react to threats. It designed them. And Malik, a teenage coder exposing gentrification zoning through public data, had tripped a wire he didn't know existed. Now he was gone. Jasmine turned back to Devin. You said they arrested him. Where? Our apartment, Devin whispered. Middle of the night. Black SUVs. No local cops. They didn't say where they were taking him. Just said he'd be held under national cyber protocols. That was 11 months ago. Jasmine felt a deep pull in her chest. A familiar one. She'd been there. The silence. The sudden vanishing. The legal limbo. She placed a hand on Devin's shoulder. I believe you, she said, and I believe your brother. Devin didn't cry, but his shoulders sagged like a storm had passed through him. That night, Jasmine didn't sleep. By morning, her entire war room was restructured. Files were cleared, maps rebuilt. Malik's case went to the top of the board. Jasmine held a full staff briefing, brought everyone in at 6:45 a.m. sharp. She didn't sugarcoat it. Project Echo is real, she said. It's still active, and it's targeting civilians who speak out before they do anything wrong. We now have proof. Code logs, threat scores, and a black site list we're triangulating. She paused. The first name on that list is a 19-year-old black coder who built a data map for community zoning. Silence. Jasmine looked at them all. We brought down one empire, but the machine didn't stop. It just updated. No one left the room. Frank Dalton contacted her 2 days later. You just found the second layer, he said through a secure line. Echo wasn't supposed to go live domestically. It was built for war zones, to pre-identify insurgents before they made a move. But when GrayNet went dark, they needed something leaner, cleaner, invisible. And they're using it on U.S. citizens? They're using it on anyone who fits a certain pattern. Race, age, income, online behavior, legal history, predictive jurisprudence. It's automated oppression with a patriotic facelift. Jasmine's voice hardened. I need locations. Frank sent her coordinates. One stood out. A facility outside of Reno. Federal property. No signage. No court records attached. Malik's there, Jasmine said. I'd bet my clearance on it, Frank replied. But if you go after them legally, they'll bury it. You need to go bigger. Jasmine didn't hesitate. I'm going public. The next morning, Jasmine stood in front of national media again. But this time, it wasn't about Ashcroft. It was about the future. I'm here today not to talk about the cases we've overturned or the man we exposed, she said. I'm here to talk about the child who walked into my office and what he gave me. She held up the echo.log drive. This isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't exaggeration. This is code written by our government, used by private contractors to identify and isolate American citizens before they ever break a law. She paused. One of them is a teenager named Malik. He built an app to expose housing injustice. For that, he was disappeared. 11 months, no trial, no contact, no rights. Her voice was steady now, fire wrapped in calm. That ends now. Jasmine had taken on judges, prosecutors, billionaires, but what she was facing now didn't wear a face. It didn't shake hands or sign orders in ink. It moved in code. It evolved in silence. It was everywhere and nowhere. It was called Project Echo, but within federal vaults, buried under hundreds of terabytes of sealed intelligence, it had another name, Shadow Protocol. 2 weeks after her press conference exposing Echo.log and Malik's disappearance, Jasmine stood at the head of the Crockett Initiative's war room, flanked by Cole, Saul, and Frank Dalton, staring at a projection of what looked like a spiderweb written in blood. Names, redacted files, contracts, AI engine patents, target profiles, keywords, disruptive black leaders, public organizers, predictive threat modeling, suppression prioritization. Tier 1, Cole circled one node in red. This is the core, a data pipeline running from Helix Strat through an obscure cybersecurity shell firm called Dynasync, which on paper provided municipal infrastructure upgrades to local governments. In reality, it funneled metadata collected from schools, clinics, community centers, and legal firms back to a black budget system used by defense contractors. Jasmine read the line of code that confirmed it. Intervention, Cole whispered. That's the euphemism. It meant surveillance, detainment, discrediting, disappearance. It meant Malik. Frank, his face grimmer than usual, slid a document across the table, a declassified memo. Jasmine recognized the format, SIGINT level, NSA traffic. This is from 5 years ago, Frank said. It outlines the prototype for Shadow Protocol, originally designed for deployment in counterinsurgency operations overseas, Iraq, Afghanistan, urban zones. The idea was to use AI to predict radicalization, stop terrorism before it happened. He paused. But then they brought it home. Jasmine clenched her jaw. And changed the definition of radical. Frank nodded. Radical became anyone organizing against systemic injustice. Any whistleblower, activist, or voice growing too loud, too fast. Jasmine stepped back, staring at the board. The truth was no longer theory. It was infrastructure. Later that night, Jasmine sat alone in her office, staring at a single image. Malik's intake form from the Reno site. Frank had secured it through an old contact inside Homeland Security. Malik had been registered under non-civilian detainee protocol, flagged as a Tier 1 predictive risk. His official crime? Potential disruption of municipal stability via data exposure? No charges, no trial, no access to counsel. He'd been buried by a forecast. Jasmine picked up the phone and called a number she hadn't dialed in years. Senator Valdez's office, the voice answered. Tell her Jasmine Crockett has something that will make the Patriot Act look like a pamphlet. 3 days later, Jasmine was inside the United States Capitol, seated in a closed-door intelligence oversight session. It was a room meant for whispers, soundproof walls, no recording devices, no press. Only senators, legal advisors, and a handful of cleared experts. Jasmine wasn't invited. She demanded her way in. She stood at the far end of the table with a thumb drive in one hand and a folder marked Confidential Citizen Threat Evaluation Index in the other. "I'm not here to lecture you," she began. "I'm here to tell you what you've allowed to happen under your silence." She projected screenshots from echo.log, faces, scores, detainment orders. Then the next slide. Names of senators whose own offices had been swept by the surveillance net as tests. Some of the people in the room had been scored by the very system they'd funded. "Shadow protocol is not protecting this country," she said. "It's profiling it, manipulating it, gutting the Constitution and disguising it as data hygiene." She turned to the Senate Intelligence Chair. "And unless this body moves now, this program will not only survive, it will go private." For the first time in the session, no one interrupted her. But Jasmine wasn't done. The very next morning, she filed a federal motion in the Southern District of New York, demanding emergency injunctive relief against Halexstrat and Dynasync, citing violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, as well as international human rights statutes. The lawsuit named 3 executives. One of them had previously served as a deputy in Ashcroft's judicial office. This wasn't just exposure anymore. It was litigation warfare. The news exploded. The headlines were relentless. Jasmine Crockett sues defense giants over AI suppression system. Shadow Protocol, the surveillance program you were never meant to know. Civil rights icon takes aim at predictive policing 2.0. And deep inside those headlines, the public began to shift. Parents, students, educators, journalists, legal clinics. People started coming forward with strange letters, unexpected audits, disappearances of digital files, loss of job offers. One woman found her foster application rejected because of anomalous risk scoring in a sealed family services database. It had been everywhere, hidden under patriotism, sanitized through software. Until now. Malik was extracted 2 weeks later. It took every favor Frank had, a federal writ, a sealed motion. Jasmine met him outside a gray building with no name, flanked by 2 silent men in windbreakers. He was thinner, quieter, but his eyes still burned with clarity. He stepped out and looked at Jasmine. "You actually came," she nodded. "You weren't wrong, and you're not alone anymore." They didn't hug. There was too much pain for that. But when they walked away, Malik turned once to look back. The building behind him had no sign, no address, and now, no power. Back in D.C., Jasmine faced the committee again, this time in public. The hearing was televised. She walked in wearing a plain black suit, no jewelry, no notes. The room was full. Reporters, activists, lobbyists, even former clients. Saul sat in the front row, Devin beside him. Jasmine stood and took the oath, then looked straight into the cameras. "When you give machines the authority to decide who is dangerous, without trial, without rights, without oversight, you are not preventing crime. You are inventing it. You are turning fear into law, and you are doing it not to protect democracy, but to control it." Shadow Protocol didn't just flag activists. It silenced them. It erased them before they spoke. And if not for a scared 16-year-old walking into my office with a plastic bag and a code, you'd still be pretending it didn't exist. You cannot regulate this. You must end it. Today, completely. Or tomorrow, someone else disappears. And maybe next time, it's not someone poor, or black, or small. Maybe it's one of you. She stepped down. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. Within 48 hours, the Senate passed Emergency Resolution 109A, the Predictive Surveillance Moratorium Act. Within 3 weeks, Halexstrat's shares collapsed. A class action lawsuit led by the Crockett Initiative surged past 1 million digital signatures. 2 international watchdogs opened investigations into U.S. data abuse. 3 more whistleblowers came forward. And inside the initiative, the whiteboard that once showed Ashcroft's empire was wiped clean. In its place, a single phrase written in red. "Truth is a moving target. Stay faster." Because Jasmine Crockett had seen enough to know. This war wasn't over. It had only changed form. They tried to predict who would resist them. Jasmine Crockett didn't just resist. She rewrote the rules. And this time, the system didn't get a second chance. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. For 25 years, Judge Richard Harlan ruled his courtroom like a tyrant, silencing lawyers, destroying lives, and hiding behind the law. But then Jasmine Crockett appeared. She didn't just walk into his courtroom to defend her client. She came to tear his empire down from the inside. What happened next shook the entire justice system to its core. How did one black woman turn Georgia's most feared judge into a criminal, right in his own courtroom? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The courtroom in Jefferson County, Georgia, wasn't just a place of law. It was Judge Richard Harlan's kingdom. For 25 years, he ruled from the bench with cold authority, silencing attorneys not with shouting, but with a glance sharp enough to cut. The walls seemed to absorb the weight of injustice, and everyone who entered knew. Here, the law bent to Harlan's will. His gavel didn't deliver justice. It delivered finality. Defense lawyers, especially those of color, treaded carefully, knowing one misstep could ruin a life. Today, though, the air felt different. The gallery was tense, eyes darting, breaths held. Even the bailiff stood taller, tighter. Something was coming, not just a trial, but a storm. Jasmine Crockett walked into that courtroom like a loaded weapon, silent, steady, and deadly precise. Years ago, she had stood in that very spot, fresh out of law school, idealistic, naive. Back then, she believed justice was blind, but Richard Harlan taught her otherwise. He'd humiliated her in open court, cut her down mid-sentence, laughed off her objections like she was a child playing dress-up in a grown-up game. He didn't just dismiss her arguments, he dismissed her existence. That day, she walked out of the courtroom broken, but not beaten. She made a vow, not just to become better, but to come back. And now she had. But she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for a reckoning. Her client, Tyrone Wilkes, sat beside her, wrists chained, eyes heavy with the weight of every black man who had ever been accused before proven, condemned before heard. A decorated veteran, a father, a man who served his country and came home to be treated like a threat. The evidence against him was paper thin, built on a shaky witness and a forced confession. But that didn't matter in Harlan's courtroom. Not when the defendant was black, and the system was built to swallow men like Tyrone whole. Jasmine knew this wasn't just another trial. This was war, and every move she made had to be precise, not just to save Tyrone, but to expose the rot beneath the robe. Because in this fight, the truth wasn't just her weapon, it was her only chance. And just like that, it started. The moment Jasmine Crockett stood up to deliver her first objection, the tone of the entire courtroom shifted. Not because she was wrong, not because her arguments lacked merit, but because Judge Richard Harlan had already decided she didn't matter. She had walked into the courtroom fully prepared, armed with meticulously organized files, color-coded tabs, legal precedents, case notes, witness statements, timestamps, and cross-examination strategies drilled to precision. Every detail, every possibility she had accounted for. She'd fought too many battles to come in blind. But preparation, she was about to learn again, meant nothing in a courtroom where the rules bent around the man with the gavel. From the bench, Harlan didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded the room like an old general who had long forgotten what it meant to be challenged. His eyes, cold, calculating, scanned her not like a lawyer, but like an insect he meant to swat. The moment Jasmine opened her mouth, citing a foundational precedent on admissibility of late disclosed evidence, Harlan shut her down. "Counselor," he said sharply, eyes narrowing, "this court has no time for theatrics or long-winded arguments. Move on." Jasmine froze for a split second, not in fear, but in calculation. It was fast, too fast. The objection wasn't even fully spoken, and already it was dismissed like a child's complaint. She inhaled deeply, glanced quickly at her co-counsel, and pivoted. She would try again. later. But then came the next blow. The prosecution stood up, a young ADA named Philip Calloway. Fresh out of law school, polished hair, expensive watch, cocky demeanor. His opening statement fumbled, tripping over legal jargon like a student in a mock trial. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, voice slightly too loud, "we, intend to prove, beyond any reasonable assumption, that the defendant, Mr. Wilkes, knowingly and, with malice, committed armed larceny." He cleared his throat awkwardly. Robbery. But Harlan didn't interrupt. Not once. Instead, he leaned forward, almost as if encouraging him, smiling faintly when the boy got lost in his own words, offering nods of assurance, even gently steering him when he fumbled a citation. "You're referring to State versus Morales, correct?" Harlan interjected smoothly, like a teacher helping a favorite student. Yes, Your Honor," Calloway stammered, grateful. "Exactly." And then came the first witness, a convenience store clerk, claiming to have seen Tyrone Wilkes fleeing the scene of an armed robbery. Mid-50s, hunched posture, eyes darting around the courtroom. Jasmine noticed immediately. He was nervous. His hands shook slightly. He paused too long. His eyes didn't meet anyone's. As he took the stand and was sworn in, his voice wavered. "Mr. Thomas," Calloway began confidently, walking toward the jury, "can you tell us what you saw on the night of March 14th? The man swallowed hard. I was behind the register," he said, glancing at his lap. "I heard shouting, real loud, looked up and saw someone running out the door." "And is that person in the courtroom today?" Calloway asked, gesturing with an open hand. Thomas hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Tyrone, then quickly away. I think so. Yeah, he had the same build, similar jacket." "You're saying it was the defendant, Mr. Wilkes?" It looked like him, but I didn't get a real good look, you know. It all happened so fast." Calloway pressed on, voice firmer. "But you're telling this court under oath that you saw the defendant at the scene." The witness shifted in his seat. I believe so. Yes. I believe it was him." Calloway turned to the jury, arms crossed like he'd just cracked the case. "No further questions, Your Honor." But Jasmine noticed. Thomas was nervous. His hands shook slightly. He paused too long. His eyes didn't meet anyone's. He said he thought he saw Tyrone, but wasn't entirely sure. Jasmine made notes. When her turn came to cross-examine, she approached with precision and respect. "Mr. Thomas," she said calmly, "you said you think you saw my client the night of the incident. Can you clarify? How sure are you?" Before the witness could even speak, Harlan's voice cracked through the room like a whip. "Counselor," he barked, "you're badgering the witness." "No, Your Honor," Jasmine replied, keeping her tone level. "I'm simply seeking a clear answer for the record." "Move on," Harlan snapped. She looked at him for half a second, searching for any hint of judicial neutrality. There was none. She turned back to the jury instead. "Let them see. Let them feel the imbalance." Then came the evidence. Jasmine had spent weeks gathering documents that placed Tyrone on the other side of town during the time of the crime. ATM logs, security camera timestamps, even a sworn affidavit from his employer. She presented them, one by one, and watched as Harlan flipped through them with deliberate boredom. He didn't ask for clarification. He didn't allow Calloway to respond. He simply muttered, "Not directly relevant," and pushed them aside. Her hands tightened slightly on the table's edge. "Your Honor," she said, measured but firm, "this evidence directly rebuts the prosecution's timeline. It's critical to the defense." "It's redundant and speculative," Harlan replied without even looking up. "We're not here to waste the court's time. Under the rules of discovery, I have every right to—" He cut her off. "Ms. Crockett," he said, voice dropping into something almost mocking, "I don't need a lecture on the law in my own courtroom." The words hit hard, not just because they were disrespectful, but because they were strategic. He wanted her rattled. He wanted the jury to see her flustered, out of control, as if her passion equaled incompetence. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She held his gaze for just 1 second too long, enough to send a message. I see exactly what you're doing. Still, the damage had begun. The jury watched. The gallery whispered. Even the court clerk shifted uneasily. And yet the pattern continued. Every time Jasmine tried to question a flaw in the prosecution's narrative, objection. Every time she pointed out a contradiction, overruled. Every time she requested clarification, denied. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, and Harlan wielded the blade with surgical precision. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and Harlan had already written the ending. Jasmine's co-counsel leaned in, whispering, "We're being boxed in. They're not even pretending to play fair." She nodded slightly, lips tight. "I know," she said, "but let them keep going. Let them expose themselves." The courtroom was no longer just a stage for legal arguments. It had become a pressure cooker. After Jasmine's cross-examination was cut short and the witness's shaky testimony was allowed to stand unchallenged, something shifted in the air. Jurors shifted in their seats. Not drastically, just enough. A sideways glance, a raised eyebrow. One juror, a middle-aged man in a brown blazer, tapped his pen against the desk without realizing it. Another, a woman with silver-streaked hair, narrowed her eyes at the judge's bench. Lips pursed like she was holding back a question she wasn't allowed to ask. No one said a word, but the room felt like it was holding its breath. They weren't lawyers, but they knew what fairness should look like. And this wasn't it. They had seen Jasmine silenced, overruled, dismissed like a child. They had seen Calloway stumble his way through the trial and still receive every benefit of the doubt. And whether they wanted to admit it or not, they were witnessing a courtroom tilted by the weight of a single man's bias. On the benches behind the bar, the gallery wasn't idle either. A row of legal reporters sat in the back, pens scribbling furiously, eyes darting between Jasmine, the judge, and the jury. One reporter, a seasoned journalist for the Georgia Legal Observer, had already flipped to her second notepad. Another leaned into his colleague and whispered, "This isn't just bad optics. This is something else." Their instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a tough trial. It was a case unraveling in real time under the weight of judicial manipulation. Cameras weren't allowed in the room, but every pen stroke felt like a recording of injustice. Even the court sketch artist had stopped drawing Calloway's expression and started sketching Harlan's face instead. Sharper lines, colder eyes. The bailiff stood motionless, jaw clenched, eyes locked forward. He'd seen enough trials to recognize when things weren't right, but he said nothing, because no one ever said anything. Not here, not in Harlan's court. That's how the system stayed exactly the way it was. And Jasmine, she felt it all. The unspoken tension, the eyes that wouldn't meet hers. The weight of knowing the jury saw what was happening, but didn't know if they were allowed to believe it. She sat still, outwardly calm, but every muscle in her body was coiled, waiting. Because what was happening in that room wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant. And that kind of injustice, in front of that many witnesses, wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. The silence around her spoke volumes, but the whisper beside her cut deeper than anything the judge had said. Tyrone leaned in, his voice barely audible, but heavy like a man carrying a lifetime of disappointment. "Ms. Crockett," he murmured, head bowed low, eyes locked on the floor. "Don't bother anymore. This court ain't built for people like us." His shoulders, once squared with pride, now sagged like a soldier returning from a war he was never meant to win. His hands, still cuffed, twitched with helpless frustration. He wasn't just losing hope in the trial. He was losing hope in everything. In the system, in fairness, in himself. Jasmine didn't respond. Not right away. Her eyes stayed forward, cold and locked on the bench where Judge Harlan presided like a monarch over a broken kingdom. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. But inside, fire surged beneath her calm. She had seen it before. That moment when a client breaks, not because of guilt, but because of the weight of being black in a courtroom designed to bury the truth beneath procedure. Tyrone's words weren't just exhaustion, they were surrender, and she couldn't allow it. Not here, not now, not in front of Harlan, who would gladly turn that surrender into a conviction. She turned her head slowly, just enough for Tyrone to see the steel in her gaze. No words, just conviction. Silent, unshakable. Her presence told him what she refused to say aloud. We don't bow to injustice. We fight it, even when it's hopeless. Because if she gave up now, if she let his voice go unanswered, then she wasn't just losing this case. She was proving Harlan right. And Jasmine Crockett didn't come back to play by Harlan's rules. She came to break them. She didn't answer Tyrone's plea with words, but with silence sharp enough to cut through doubt. Still, as she looked back to the bench, even Jasmine couldn't deny what the courtroom had become. A battlefield tilted against her at every angle. Objections overruled, evidence excluded, witnesses redirected. Every legal pathway she stepped onto was already blocked before she could finish a sentence. And the worst part wasn't the rulings, it was the performance. Judge Harlan sat high above, calm and unreadable, as if every dismissal of her argument was routine. Beside him, Philip Calloway smirked like a man who thought the game was already won. He whispered to a colleague, chuckling, confident that the verdict had already been carved in stone behind closed doors. The courtroom felt heavier with each minute, not from the weight of the trial, but from the slow suffocation of justice itself. Jasmine knew the signs. She wasn't losing the case on facts. She was losing it on control. Harlan had seized the narrative, and every move she made was being twisted into a display of desperation. So she did the only thing a seasoned fighter could do when the tide is too strong. She pulled back, not in defeat, but in design. She stopped objecting, stopped pressing. She let the silence grow. Let the prosecution think they were cruising. Let the jury feel the void. Calloway took the bait, growing bolder with each word, his tone cockier, his posture looser. Harlan leaned back with folded arms, allowing it all to unfold like he was presiding over a courtroom drama he'd directed 100 times. But they didn't realize the truth. Jasmine wasn't stepping back to surrender. She was pulling them in, just close enough to fall. She had been silent long enough. Letting them feel victorious was part of her trap. But now it was time to spring it. As Philip Calloway droned on with false confidence, his voice beginning to rise with arrogance, Jasmine reached down and slowly opened the red tab folder she hadn't touched since the trial began. Her fingers moved with intention. Every detail, every line of text had been reviewed, highlighted, time-stamped. It was the kind of document that didn't just poke holes in the prosecution, it shattered it. With calm precision, she rose to her feet, holding the single sheet of paper high enough for the courtroom to see. Her voice when it came was low but electric. Your Honor, the defense moves to introduce new evidence. Evidence withheld by the prosecution in direct violation of Brady v. Maryland. The words hit the courtroom like a jolt. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors leaned forward, frowning. A reporter in the back stopped writing mid-sentence. Jasmine walked to the bench slowly, confidently, never breaking eye contact with the judge. This document, she said, placing it on the edge of her desk and tapping it once, is a time-stamped GPS data log that proves, beyond any doubt, that my client, Tyrone Wilkes, was not at the scene of the robbery. In fact, he was 5 miles away, inside a rehabilitation center where he signed in electronically. This information was submitted to the state 2 weeks ago by the facility's legal office and was never shared with the defense. Not once. She let that sit, her words hanging in the air like a suspended blade. Under the Brady rule, the withholding of exculpatory evidence is not just unethical, it is unconstitutional. Calloway froze. His hands clutched the edge of the podium. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Harlan's face darkened, but not with surprise, with annoyance. He didn't even glance at the paper. His reply came fast, hard, and rehearsed. Motion denied. That evidence is inadmissible and irrelevant at this stage of the trial. Jasmine blinked once, jaw tightening. Your Honor, this is a constitutional violation. The prosecution knowingly suppressed material that could prove my client's innocence. You are out of line, Ms. Crockett, Harlan snapped, leaning forward, voice now raised. I said the evidence is inadmissible. Period. Jasmine didn't back away. She took one small step forward, her hands gripping the lectern. Her voice dropped, quiet and deliberate. So the court is choosing to ignore a Brady violation on the record? Harlan's eyes narrowed to slits. The gavel came down, loud and violent. "Enough," he thundered. "This courtroom will not be turned into a soapbox for conspiracy theories. One more word and you will be held in contempt. Am I understood?" The gavel's crack echoed like a gunshot. The bailiff twitched. Jurors jolted in their seats. The gallery erupted in a wave of suppressed tension. Shuffling feet, quiet gasps, pens pausing mid-note. What had been subtle bias until now was suddenly and unmistakably exposed. One juror, an older black man in the front row, shook his head slowly, a frown growing deeper with each passing second. A woman beside him, who had remained passive for most of the trial, now looked visibly disturbed. The air in the courtroom changed. It wasn't just heavy, it was charged like the moments before a storm hits. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She sat down slowly, her back straight, her hands resting on the defense table like a general returning to command. Her expression was unreadable, not because she was confused or defeated, but because this was the moment she had been waiting for. Everything had just gone exactly to plan. While the court saw a defiant attorney being silenced by a powerful judge, Jasmine knew better. This wasn't defeat. This was the final move in a carefully laid trap, a trap that had been building for weeks, step by silent step. Because Jasmine hadn't walked into this courtroom expecting justice. She had walked in expecting war, and she came armed with something far more powerful than a sharp tongue or airtight case law. She came armed with the truth and proof that the system was rigged against it. For days she'd let Harlan show his true colors, never stopping him, never shouting over him, never letting emotion get the better of her. Every denied objection, every smirk, every moment he interrupted her mid-sentence or validated Calloway's fumbling arguments had been quietly logged, not by chance, not by luck, but by design. 3 rows behind her, seated like any ordinary trial watcher, was a journalist from the Southern Law Ledger, a longtime court reporter with federal credentials and a reputation for exposing legal misconduct. Jasmine had called in a favor, and he wasn't just taking notes. He was transcribing injustice in real time, his fingers flying across his notepad like a stenographer possessed. 2 rows to the right, dressed in a modest gray suit, sat Angela Cho, an investigator with the State Bar's Ethics Enforcement Division. Officially, she was observing courtroom procedure for continuing education. Unofficially, she had been sent by Jasmine's team with the quiet support of civil rights watchdog groups to record every deviation from proper judicial conduct. She was already on her 3rd page. Sitting near the back, close to the courtroom exit, was a law student intern wearing glasses and a neutral expression, one of Jasmine's own team members, planted months earlier during jury selection week. He had memorized every motion denied, every irregularity in Harlan's courtroom behavior. His pocket carried a time-stamped notebook. His phone, tucked in his lap, recorded audio legally under the state's one-party consent statute for public court proceedings. He hadn't looked up once. He didn't need to. He was building a timeline, a case within the case. Even the courtroom sketch artist, hired through neutral court channels, had been subtly briefed. Jasmine didn't need her to lie, just to be honest, to draw what she saw, the judge's visible hostility, the contrast between his softness toward Calloway and his cold disdain toward Jasmine. The gavel raised in fury, the jaw clenched, the pointing finger, all captured in charcoal and ink. No camera could have done it better. And as for the jury, Jasmine hadn't spoken to them, hadn't looked at them more than necessary, but she had felt them watching. Not just her, but the pattern, the weight of it, the imbalance. You couldn't silence the truth forever, not when 12 people were watching it unravel before their eyes. She didn't say another word after the Brady motion was denied. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She let the silence settle, let the tension ferment, let the weight of injustice become so heavy it pressed down on every person in that room. Philip Calloway, oblivious to what was coming, leaned back in his chair, smug and relaxed. He believed he'd won. So did Harlan. The judge leaned into the bench, face composed, as if he had restored order and reasserted control. But they didn't realize the irony. By trying to silence Jasmine, they had spoken louder than she ever could. The evidence of bias wasn't just in her notes, it was now in theirs. And that's when she glanced, just once, over her shoulder. Angela Cho looked up and gave a single subtle nod. The reporter raised his pen, finished his final line, and closed the notebook with a soft snap. The sketch artist paused, brush in the air, eyes locked on Harlan's scowl. The pieces were in place. The trap had closed. And Jasmine Crockett. She folded her hands, sat still, waited, because she knew something the rest of the courtroom didn't. The next sound they would hear wouldn't be a gavel. It would be the heavy wooden doors opening, and justice, long delayed, would finally walk in. And then it happened. The silence in the courtroom was sharp enough to cut. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, electric, like the final inhale before lightning splits the sky. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open, not with chaos, not with noise, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of inevitability. Every pair of eyes turned, the jury, the gallery, even the bailiff. The moment cracked the room like a fault line. Two federal agents stepped inside, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other lean, older, both dressed in dark suits that made them seem carved from stone. Their footsteps echoed with surgical precision, not rushed, not hesitant. The seal of the U.S. Department of Justice gleamed on the badge held forward as they approached. No words yet, just movement, controlled, absolute. And with each step toward the bench, the temperature in the room dropped. Judge Richard Harlan, still seated high above, stared down at them like they were trespassers in his kingdom. His fingers gripped the sides of the bench as if he could stop them by force of will alone. But he didn't speak, not yet. Maybe he didn't believe it. Maybe he was waiting for someone to intervene. But no one did, because deep down everyone knew what this was. Jasmine Crockett knew. Tyrone Wilkes knew. The jurors knew. Even the prosecution had gone pale. This wasn't chaos. This was accountability walking through the front door. The taller agent stepped forward first, voice calm, measured, and devastatingly clear. Judge Richard Harlan, he said, projecting for the room to hear, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, conspiracy to tamper with court proceedings, accepting bribes, and multiple violations of civil rights under federal statute. His words landed like thunder. The sound didn't echo. It stuck, hanging in the air, pressing against the marble, the oak, the chest of every soul in that room. Harlan's lips parted. He blinked once. For a moment, he looked very old. This is absurd, he spat, standing up abruptly. His voice cracked, and a full glass of water on the bench tipped, shattering on the floor beside him. I'm in the middle of a trial. You don't have jurisdiction to barge into my courtroom like this. His voice rose in pitch, not in control but in panic. I am the sitting judge on record. The second agent stepped up beside his partner, eyes cold, voice steady. And this courtroom is now a federal crime scene. Harlan recoiled, shaking his head violently. This is my courtroom, he shouted louder now, voice fraying at the edges. These people are in my charge. And then came the sentence that ended everything. No, the agent replied, they're not yours anymore. The silence that followed wasn't just still. It was heavy, unforgiving. The gallery sat motionless. The reporters' pens hovered midair. A juror's jaw dropped slightly. Philip Calloway, who had been seated until that moment, stood and immediately sat back down again, as if unsure of what to do with his hands, his posture, his career. The bailiff didn't move. He wasn't stopping it. No one was. The reign of Judge Harlan, untouchable, unchallenged, was over. And it was ending right in front of the people he once ruled without question. The taller agent reached forward, calm and professional. Sir, place your hands behind your back. Harlan didn't obey, not at first. He stood frozen, fingers clenched, eyes darting across the room as if expecting someone, anyone, to object. But none came. There were no defenders, no loyal voices, no final authority to shield him from what was now unavoidable. Slowly, reluctantly, his arms moved behind his back. The agent brought the cuffs forward. The click of steel was louder than any gavel ever struck. Judge Richard Harlan, the man who had silenced attorneys, dismissed defendants, manipulated justice, and spoken law as if it were his own personal doctrine, was now handcuffed on the very bench from which he once judged others. His black robes sagged at the shoulders. His face was pale. He looked not like a figure of power, but like a man unmasked. Flash bulbs fired from the back as journalists captured history unfolding. The courtroom sketch artist dropped her pencil. The court stenographer paused for the first time all morning. A few people in the gallery gasped quietly. Others said nothing, just stared in stunned awe. The jurors, still sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide the disbelief on their faces. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched. Her eyes locked on the man who once humiliated her in this very room, who had buried countless defendants under the weight of bias disguised as authority, who had gambled everything on the assumption that power made him untouchable. And now that man stood in handcuffs. Not a judge, not even a symbol, just another man who thought the law was his to control until it came for him instead. And Jasmine, steady and silent, had made sure it finally did. The echoes of the handcuffs had barely faded when the courtroom door opened again, quietly without drama. There were no agents this time, no shouting, no flash of authority, just calm, practiced footsteps. Judge Raymond Ellis entered, his presence alone grounding the room like a reset of reality. His reputation preceded him, measured, incorruptible, the kind of man whose silence often said more than another judge's ruling. He wore his robe like a responsibility, not a symbol, and when he took the bench, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale. Finally, someone who hadn't been bought, bent, or blinded by power. He gave a nod to the jury, looked once at the defense, then gently to Jasmine. "Ms. Crockett, the court recognizes you." She didn't move at first. The gravity of what had just happened still hung in the air, clinging to the walls like smoke from a fire that had scorched everything. She glanced at Tyrone Wilkes, still in cuffs, still seated like a man bracing for a verdict that wasn't real. He didn't meet her eyes. He was still waiting for the moment it would all fall apart again. Jasmine stood, not with triumph, but with purpose. Her suit was wrinkled at the elbows. Her voice was hoarse from hours of argument, but her presence was immovable. "Your Honor," she began, calm but cold, "I move to dismiss all charges against my client, Tyrone Wilkes, with prejudice." A murmur rippled through the gallery, but she didn't react. Her focus was locked on the bench, her words chosen like instruments of surgery, not for effect, but for truth. What this court witnessed today was not just the arrest of a judge. It was the exposure of a system that allowed a man like Harlan to sit on that bench for 25 years and mistake power for law. She took a breath, not to compose herself, but to let the words land. "This trial was compromised before it ever began," she continued. "From the moment we entered this courtroom, the rules were rewritten in real time to serve one goal: conviction, not based on fact, not based on truth, but based on who held the gavel. Every motion was denied before it could be heard. Every piece of evidence that pointed to my client's innocence was deemed inadmissible without review. The prosecution was guided, protected, and coached, not by law, but by favor." She turned slowly toward the jury, not to persuade, but to honor them. "And yet, despite all of it, you saw it. You felt it. You heard every word, every silence. Every time I was told to sit down, not because I was wrong, but because I was inconvenient. And most of all, you saw what they did to Mr. Wilkes, a veteran, a citizen, a man who was presumed guilty the moment he walked into this room. Not because of evidence, but because of bias, because of history, because of who he is." Then she turned back to Judge Ellis, and her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of everything left unsaid. "This court cannot pretend that removing Judge Harlan fixes what's already broken. This was not a fair trial. It was a performance, a weaponization of the robe. And if we allow this case to continue, knowing what we know now, then we are complicit. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for pity. I am demanding the law hold itself accountable. Dismiss this case, not as an exception, but as the first sign that justice still means something in this room." She paused. "This trial never should have happened. Not like this. Not under him. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a script. and my client was never meant to survive it. She stepped back, and the room held its breath again, not because of fear, but because the truth had been laid bare. And now, it had nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed Jasmine's motion stretched long and heavy, like the final breath before a verdict drops. Judge Ellis sat motionless behind the bench, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the case file resting open in front of him. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, but the room dared not make a sound. Even the air seemed to pause. Jasmine remained standing, her back straight, eyes calm, though her pulse hammered against her ribs like a war drum. Tyrone sat beside her, motionless, his cuffed hands clasped between his knees. He didn't look up. After everything, he trained himself not to. He didn't believe in second chances anymore. Not in courtrooms like this. Not after what he'd seen. But Judge Ellis believed in the law. The real law. The one that existed not to protect the powerful, but to defend the defenseless. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice low but resonant, filling the room with the kind of gravity only truth can bring. Having reviewed the trial record in full, he began, eyes locked on the document in front of him, including testimony, evidentiary rulings, and the recent developments involving former Judge Harlan. It is the finding of this court that the trial proceedings were fundamentally and irreversibly compromised. His voice didn't waver, didn't rise. It didn't need to. The repeated suppression of lawful objections, denial of exculpatory evidence, and the clear pattern of judicial misconduct have not only eroded the integrity of this case, but have violated the most basic tenets of due process under the Constitution. He looked up, directly at Tyrone, and for the first time in the entire trial, a judge looked at him not as a case file, but as a man. Therefore, Judge Ellis continued, all charges against Mr. Tyrone Wilkes are hereby dismissed, with prejudice. He is to be released from custody immediately. Time didn't explode. It cracked, quietly, profoundly, like a shell finally splitting after years of pressure. Tyrone didn't react at first. He sat still, his breath shallow, as if waiting for the judge to take it back. But the words were real. The gavel struck once, not in anger, but as confirmation. The bailiff approached, far gentler than before, and for once the keys didn't symbolize confinement. They meant something else entirely. The handcuffs came off. The sound of metal releasing was soft, but it cut louder than anything else had that day. Tyrone looked down at his wrists. His skin was raw, where the cuffs had rubbed too long, too tight. He turned his hands over as if seeing them for the first time. Hands that had built, carried, fought, and been shackled by a lie. His chest hitched. His jaw trembled. Then came the tears. Not theatrical, not performative. Just a man who had survived the kind of silence most don't come back from. He buried his face in his hands and sobbed. Heavy, gasping sobs that pulled everything out of him he'd held in for years. Jasmine stood beside him, still composed, still. But her eyes softened as she placed a hand gently on his shoulder. No words yet. Not while he wept. Not while he crumbled into the truth of his own freedom. When he finally looked up, red-eyed, lips parted, shaking, she leaned in and spoke quietly, but firmly. This is your moment, Tyrone. You earned it. You survived it. She squeezed his shoulder once. But don't mistake this for the finish line. He blinked at her, confused, lost in the magnitude of the moment. And then she said it. The words she'd carried with her since the day she took this case. The words no verdict could replace. Your freedom is the beginning. Real justice. That's something bigger. That means fixing the system that tried to break you. That means making sure no one else ever sits in that chair again for a crime they didn't commit. Tyrone stared at her, his breath still ragged, but his head nodded once, slowly. It wasn't just agreement. It was understanding. A man who had nearly been buried by the law was now, somehow, standing on the edge of helping reshape it. Around them, the courtroom was still. The jury sat speechless. The reporters had stopped writing. Even Calloway, now seated alone at the prosecution's table, looked down at his own notes, hollow-eyed and shaken. The system had shown its teeth. and for once, it had been forced to swallow the consequences. But Jasmine wasn't basking in the moment. She didn't raise her hands in victory. She didn't turn to the crowd or let herself collapse in relief. She stood like she always had, resolute, focused, already thinking ahead. Because this one trial was over. But the war had only just begun. Tyrone's freedom was a beginning, not a conclusion. In the days that followed the trial, Jasmine Crockett didn't attend press conferences. She didn't sit for interviews, didn't bask in headlines, didn't soak in applause. Because while the cameras were still zoomed in on a disgraced judge being led away in cuffs, Jasmine's eyes were already scanning the bigger picture, one far darker than anything the world had seen in that single courtroom. What happened to Tyrone wasn't an exception. It was a symptom, a warning flare from a system that had been quietly bleeding people dry for years. And Richard Harlan hadn't just been a corrupt judge. He'd been a gatekeeper of injustice, and the gate had been wide open for decades. So Jasmine did what she'd always done. She fought back, not with anger, but with action. She founded Justice Reclaimed, not as a nonprofit, not as a PR stunt, but as a war room, a legal strike force designed to do what no court, no committee, and no politician had dared to attempt. A full-scale audit of every case Richard Harlan had ever presided over. She and her team compiled a list of over 3,000 dockets dating back 25 years. Names, numbers, charges, sentences. Every one of them a possible casualty of a man who had abused the robe like a weapon. She assembled a team, not just lawyers, but data analysts, retired judges, exonerees, former public defenders who had once stood in that same courtroom and whispered, "There's something wrong here," but had never been heard. They formed working groups, scanned transcripts, flagged rulings with patterns of suppression. They created heat maps of judicial bias. They ran algorithms on sentence disparities. They tracked how often Harlan overruled black attorneys versus white ones. The data spoke louder than any opening statement ever could. And what they found was devastating. There were men serving 20 years for crimes where the only evidence was a coerced confession, women whose testimony had been dismissed as emotional, minors tried as adults, veterans like Tyrone who had never stood a chance. The same phrases repeated in transcript after transcript: objection overruled, inadmissible, motion denied, like a script written in ink, not blood, but with the same effect. Over time, it became clear Harlan hadn't just passed judgment, he'd orchestrated outcomes. But now, for the first time, his victims had a voice. Cases long forgotten were being reopened. Judges were issuing new hearings. Innocent people who had given up on freedom were now being called back to courtrooms, not to be punished again, but to be heard, truly heard, for the first time. Some wept. Some didn't believe it. Some had already lost everything and came only to say, "I told you." But they came. And with every reopened case, the shadow Harlan had cast over the justice system shrank just a little more. The media started calling it the Crockett docket revolution. Editorials ran with headlines like "One Lawyer's Crusade Against Corruption" and "The Undoing of Jefferson County." But Jasmine didn't care for the spotlight. She stayed in the trenches, reviewing records, meeting families, speaking with the wrongfully convicted, many of whom had no one left waiting for them outside prison walls. Her goal was never the headlines. Her goal was repair. And every time a case was overturned, every time a family was reunited, every time an apology was issued where silence once lived, Jasmine reminded her team why they started. Because justice is not justice if it only arrives for the lucky few. She knew the system wouldn't fix itself. She knew for every Harlan caught, there were others still robed, still ruling unchecked. But she also knew this: the silence was broken. The fear had shifted. Power was being questioned. And she had proven, once and for all, that no one, not even the bench, is above the law. Justice Reclaimed didn't just review cases. It forced the entire state to ask itself a question. What happens when a judge becomes the criminal and no one notices for 25 years? And thanks to Jasmine Crockett, they couldn't ignore the answer anymore. The system was trembling, not collapsing, not yet. but trembling, undeniably. One overturned case became three. Three became nine. Old rulings were vacated, prosecutors were put under scrutiny, and internal investigations began to quietly unfold in counties across the state. What Jasmine Crockett had triggered wasn't just a ripple, it was a shift in the ground itself, a deep overdue reckoning in a structure that had stood for too long on the backs of the voiceless. And the press, they noticed. She never sought their attention, but they followed her anyway. Headlines spread faster than case files. Her name appeared in op-eds, morning broadcasts, late-night commentary. The New York Times called her the conscience of the courtroom. The Atlantic labeled her a scalpel in a world of hammers. But the one that stuck, the one that was repeated on cable news and echoed across civil rights blogs and legal podcasts, was the quote that made it onto the cover of The Nation beside her photo. The woman who forced justice to look at itself. It wasn't praise Jasmine craved. It was pressure. Because every spotlight, every soundbite, every microphone shoved in her face reminded her of what wasn't finished. Tyrone may have walked free, but dozens still sat in cells built by Harlan's rulings. Some were still waiting for letters from lawyers that might never come. Some had died behind bars. And Jasmine knew what the cameras wouldn't say. That exposing one corrupt judge didn't fix a machine. It just proved how easily the machine can be hijacked. So she turned the attention into fuel. While news vans parked outside her office and photojournalists waited for a staged reaction she'd never give them, Jasmine disappeared back into her files. She slept 3 hours a night. She ate takeout over court transcripts. Her apartment floor became a map of injustice. Papers, photos, notes on victims' names and what had been done to them. There were no awards on her walls, no plaques, no framed magazine covers. Just a calendar with names and deadlines. Each red circle wasn't a celebration, it was a promise. She gave speeches, not at banquets, but in classrooms. She mentored students who didn't believe they could make it to law school because they'd never seen someone like her at the top. She showed up in juvenile courts where other lawyers wouldn't. She filed motions in rural counties that had never seen a black woman in a courtroom, except behind the defense table. And she kept saying the same thing, again and again, to whoever would listen. Justice isn't something that arrives. It's something you go get. She didn't soften her message for comfort. She didn't adjust her tone to sound palatable. Jasmine Crockett didn't give the system an exit ramp. She stood in its way. In one televised interview, a reporter asked her how it felt to have changed the landscape of justice in Georgia. Jasmine stared at him for a beat too long, then answered, "I didn't change it. I just exposed it. Now we have to decide if we're brave enough to fix it." Even some of her critics began to fall quiet. Lawyers who once whispered that she was too loud, too angry, now asked to sit in on her case reviews. Judges who had doubted her started revisiting their own rulings. Prosecutors began assigning senior staff to double-check past cases. Bit by bit, inch by inch, the culture began to shift. Not everywhere, not fast enough, but undeniably. Still, Jasmine refused to take credit because she remembered every time she walked into court and was told she was being too emotional. Every time a judge looked at her hair instead of her briefs. Every time a client cried in a back room because they thought no one would believe them. She remembered standing in front of Judge Harlan as a young attorney and being humiliated for daring to speak. And she remembered that feeling, the quiet, burning sense that the rules were never written for her, only against her. That memory stayed with her longer than any applause ever could. Years passed. Justice reclaimed expanded into multiple states. Federal grants were awarded. Partner law schools joined. More than 200 cases were under review, and several led to full exonerations. Jasmine declined every invitation to run for office. She didn't want to be a senator. She didn't want to be a judge. She wanted to stay where the damage was, in the trenches. There was one night, late, long after the news cycle had moved on, when Jasmine walked back into the same courtroom where it all started. The lights were off. The air was still. The judge's bench sat empty. She stood there alone, facing the rows of pews, the jury box, the witness stand. No audience, no jury, just memory. She stepped to the defense table and rested her hand on the wood. This was where she'd nearly lost. This was where Harlan had tried to break her. This was where justice had once been denied, and then reclaimed. And she whispered just to herself, "You don't get to own this place anymore." Then she turned and walked out. Because the courtroom didn't define her. Her fight did, and it wasn't over. Not until the scales balanced for everyone. Not just the ones lucky enough to find a fighter like her. Justice had finally looked at itself, and it had seen Jasmine Crockett, staring back, unafraid, unbending, and still moving forward. Justice, Jasmine Crockett's crusade teaches, is not a marble abstraction, but a living, breathing organism that can be starved or fed, bruised or healed. So the first blistering lesson is that vigilance must be relentless, because corruption rarely announces itself with banners and brass bands, but instead seeps into court calendars, discovery deadlines, whispered hallway deals, and off-the-record smiles, thriving precisely because ordinary people assume the paperwork is too dense, the tradition too sacred, or the gatekeepers too learned to err. Yet one determined lawyer proved the opposite by treating every ignored footnote, every overruled objection, every side-eyed smirk as a breadcrumb on a trail that eventually led not merely to a single tyrant cracked open, but to a system forced to see its own reflection and recoil. The second lesson, hammered out on the anvil of grisly reality, is that injustice hides most comfortably inside routine humiliation. Those moments when a judge mocks a young attorney's diction, when a bailiff smirks as shackles click shut on a defendant who can't afford bail, when a clerk misfiles exculpatory evidence because nobody will double-check. Because each tiny cut seems survivable until years later, you realize the body politic has been bleeding out the whole time. And Jasmine refused to let those minor insults remain minor, cataloging them until she could present a mosaic of misconduct so vast even the most comfortable observer could no longer pretend it was all coincidence. Third comes the revelation about power. It is allergic to sunlight and nourished by fatigue, meaning that tyrants do not fear outrage. Outrage burns hot and then cools, but dread persistence, the quiet, disciplined drumbeat of a woman who refuses to leave, who studies transcripts at 3 a.m., who converts every dismissal into data, every insult into evidence, and every snicker into another nail in the coffin of a corrupt reign. Because power, once cornered by that kind of methodical courage, loses its swagger and eventually its oxygen. Fourth, the saga dismantles the myth that a single firing or prison sentence fixes an institution. For Jasmine discovered that Harlan's bench was merely a broken spoke in a wheel that had rolled over human lives for decades. So she built Justice Reclaimed like a forensic autopsy, scanning thousands of dockets, feeding rulings into algorithms that glowed red wherever racial bias, sentencing disparity, or procedural cruelty spiked. And then she turned the raw, blinding data into public exhibits so transparent that even legislators who once cited isolated incidents now muttered about emergency committees and supplemental budgets to address systemic reform. Proving transparency is not optional. It is the antiseptic without which infection always returns. Fifth, her journey warns that comfort is complicity dressed in silk robes. The moment a society grows satisfied with one televised downfall, it leaves the next victim defenseless. So Jasmine rejected the talk show circuit, the book advances, the podium invitations, understanding that applause is merely the system's way of asking her to slow down, rest, and become yet another inspirational footnote instead of an ongoing threat. And she answered by launching case reviews in neighboring counties, by mentoring public defenders drowning under caseloads, and by reminding every donor that money without follow-through is just hush money in prettier clothes. Sixth, the story insists that hope is not sentimental. It is corporal, wearing jumpsuits and handcuffs, signing affidavits in cells that smell of bleach and fear. And when it is finally set loose, it does not walk out of prison gates with tidy gratitude, but with tears like Tyrone's, a flood that sweeps away the lie that wrongful convictions are statistical rounding errors. Because each tear is a data point that humanizes the spreadsheet and forces the public to confront the real cost of clerical indifference. Seventh, Jasmine's campaign underscores that no warrior wins wars alone. Investigators mind archives, Statisticians built bias heat maps. Journalists dotted newsrooms with stories that refused to die after one news cycle. And retired judges quietly coached young associates on how to withstand the procedural ambushes still lurking in courtrooms untouched by reform, proving solidarity when orchestrated with rigor can crack even the thickest concrete of institutional inertia, and that movements succeed not by crowning heroes, but by multiplying them. Eighth, and perhaps most urgent, her odyssey redefines justice as a verb that must be conjugated daily. File, appeal, argue, expose, revise. Because the instant we treat it as a static noun safely displayed behind mahogany benches, we forfeit it to those who see law as a personal cudgel, which is why Jasmine keeps her calendar thick with court dates instead of gala dinners, why her victories become checklists rather than stopping points, and why every closed case file on her desk is promptly replaced by another, because justice left unattended rusts into ritual, and ritual metastasizes into oppression. Finally, the narrative delivers a collective theology of redemption. When an innocent man steps back into sunlight, the community does more than cheer. It recalibrates. School children hear the story and internalize the difference between legal and just. Legislators reconsider bills they once ignored, and even skeptical citizens find themselves asking, if this could happen to Tyrone, whom have we already forgotten? So each exoneration becomes a seed, each seed a tree of watchfulness, and forests of vigilance are exactly what corrupted systems fear most, because forests are hard to uproot and the roots talk to one another, passing warnings underground until courage becomes contagious. Thus, Jasmine's real legacy is not the fall of Richard Harlan, nor the headlines that dubbed her the woman who forced justice to look at itself, but the echo she leaves in every courthouse hallway, a whispered, irrevocable truth that law belongs to the people, not the powerful, and it will answer to us as often as we demand, which means the story's true ending is up to anyone willing to listen, pick up the file, and keep the fight alive. And now it's your turn. Because this story, Jasmine's story, Tyrone's story, isn't meant to be watched like a movie and forgotten by morning. This isn't fiction wrapped in dramatic lighting and courtroom theatrics. This is real. It happened. And it is happening again, right now, in courtrooms you've never heard of, with judges you'll never see on the news, and defendants who don't have a Jasmine Crockett sitting beside them. The real tragedy isn't just that it took 25 years for Judge Harlan to fall. It's that thousands of others just like him are still standing, still ruling, still deciding fates behind robes and sealed doors. The question is not if injustice exists. The question is what you're going to do now that you've seen it. We tell ourselves the system is flawed, but the truth is harder than that. The system is functioning exactly as it was built to protect itself, to preserve power, to grind down the people least able to defend themselves, and do it in silence. It's not just broken. It was designed to break people. And unless people like you step into the storm, unless you choose to feel uncomfortable, to get involved, to say something when it's easier to say nothing, then it keeps going. One more trial, one more man in cuffs, one more name whispered and forgotten. But it doesn't have to stay this way. Because if one woman with a voice, a case file, and a spine made of iron can bring down a judge, imagine what we could do if we stood together. Imagine if we turned courtroom galleries into battlegrounds. If we flooded jury pools with citizens who knew their rights and refused to sleep through testimony. If we treated every biased ruling like a spark and fanned it into fire. Jasmine Crockett didn't come from money. She didn't have legacy behind her. She had fury, focus, and a refusal to let another innocent man be swallowed whole. That's it. That's the recipe, and it's one we can all follow. So let's stop pretending this fight belongs to someone else. You don't need to be a lawyer to demand justice. You don't need to wear a robe or hold a law degree to recognize what's wrong. You just have to stop looking away. You have to stop scrolling past headlines and saying, "That's awful," before moving on. Justice doesn't live in press releases or presidential speeches. It lives in the voices of people who refuse to shut up when the room gets uncomfortable. It lives in community organizers, in local election booths, in public defenders' inboxes, in court transcripts that no one's read since the verdict was sealed. It lives wherever ordinary people say, "Not this time." So what can you do? Start with your own backyard. Learn the names of the judges in your county. Pay attention to who's on the bench, not just at the Supreme Court, but in municipal courts, traffic courts, juvenile courts, because that's where injustice breeds, in the quiet, low-level places no one's watching. Volunteer at legal clinics, fund bail projects, support journalists investigating misconduct, show up to public hearings, ask your school board about restorative justice, call your city council, talk to your friends about mandatory minimums, and when someone tells you it's complicated, look them in the eye and say, "I don't care. I'm staying in the fight anyway." Because here's the truth. Jasmine Crockett is rare, but she shouldn't be. She didn't win because the system made room for her. She won because she made room for herself. And she did it not just for Tyrone, but for every person who never got their name cleared. For every family who buried a son labeled a criminal. For every parent who cried in the hallway when a sentence came down like a hammer. She didn't fight for the headline. She fought so you'd know it's possible, so you'd see her standing there and say, "If she can, maybe I can too." This is your moment. This is your mirror. The question is not whether you were moved. The question is what you'll do now that you've been awakened. So let the discomfort sit in your gut. Let the anger pulse through your chest. Let the fire Jasmine lit burn long after the screen goes dark. Because there are still cases being heard this week by judges who think no one's watching. Still men pacing cold floors in cells they don't belong in. Still women being silenced mid-sentence in courtrooms stacked against them. Still attorneys with no resources, buried in caseloads, praying for a miracle. Still prosecutors who treat human lives like stepping stones on their way to the next promotion. Still silence. Break that silence. Be louder. Be relentless. Be a witness who doesn't just watch, but acts. Because Jasmine did her part. Tyrone walked free, and now justice is knocking on your door. Will you answer, or will you let the gavel fall again on someone who didn't stand a chance? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.